Hello, you beautiful people. I've been a frequent lurker in this sub. I don't know if this qualifies. I've had a story I wanted to share for a while now, but decided to let it come to an end before posting it. Now that I came back from the notary about an hour ago, I can finally close this chapter of my life. So here it goes. I'd like to start with the fact that I live in Russia and am not a good storyteller. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll try to clarify. This all begins about 3 years ago, at my grandma's funeral. She passed away at the age of 73, leaving behind 3 sisters, a plethora of grandkids, and quite a lot of real estate. When the paperwork tsunami regarding inheritance started, something began to smell fishy. My alive aunt was extremely hesitant in giving us the death certificate, so we could start filing for inheritance. Things started to get complicated and confusing, so I had to take over all the paperwork and to help my mother out. I find out that the apartment my grandmother lived in, for some reason, no longer belonged to her, but was signed off to the kids of my aunt. Upon further inspection, I realized that most of my grandmother's belongings were signed off to my aunt long before my grandmother's death. First, I decided to speak to my mom. She told me that on the date the papers were signed, my grandmother was already in pretty bad shape. Dementia and Alzheimer's had already gotten the best of her, and she was not legally able to sign them. So I decide to go to my aunt, still not wanting to believe that she screwed us over. I, sincerely believing that it was all an honest deal, ask her how it all happened. I will never forget her response. I never thought someone could say this to a relative. She told me that it was none of my business, that she intends to get everything she can, and the rest of the real estate that will be shared property she will force us out of. I was baffled. I couldn't understand how she could do something like this to my mother. I had to do something. The next day I spoke with my mother. She was shocked and devastated, in tears. She also could not understand how her own sister could do such a thing, especially after all the things she did for her, like helping her make a career in sports, helping with money during hard times, etc., etc. I knew we needed to go to court. The problem with that was that my mother is a working pensioner and is still raising my 13-year-old brother, and I just spent all my savings on renovating her apartment. Money was an issue. Luckily, I made good friends with our company lawyer at work, and he offered to help me. We collected all the needed paperwork. He told me to document any further encounters with their family, and to keep an eye out for anything fishy. After that, we sent a letter to my aunt, saying that we will dispute everything in court. This is where my life became hell. It all started out with threat calls from her sons. That's no biggie. I recorded all of the phone conversations. They found out where I work and live and started stalking me. Again, no biggie. A while back, my boss made me an offer for a driver to pick me up to and from work, because the driver lived nearby me. About time I hit him up on that offer, so I did. One morning, I wake up and get ready to work. My driver is downstairs waiting for me. I put on a coat and head downstairs. I open the door of my apartment complex and get hit in the face by my oldest cousin. He threatens me again and flees the scene. The driver runs up, helps me up, and tells me that it was all recorded on the car's front cam, calls my boss, and takes me to the hospital. The next day, I take the video and all of the phone conversations to the police. They accept everything. When the police contacted my aunt, searching for her son that punched me, she was 553. She called me and spat threats in the phone. I reminded her that her son is already in trouble for threatening me. She hangs up. About a week later, I wake up in the middle of the night from loud banging on my door. As I'm walking to the door, it gives in and flies open. 2 large men walk in, stating this is now their apartment as well. Handing me the papers, they said, "If you want to remain healthy, you should pack your shit and go." I call the police. Police comes, checks the paperwork, and it's totally fine. Turned out, my aunt hired let's call them professional inconveniencers. They make money by forcing people to move out of shared homes. She gave them a part of her right of ownership, and they were legally allowed to move in. Next 3 months, I routinely had to pick my door because they kept changing the locks. Had to deal with constant loud music, dirt and filth in my own house. Barely any sleep. After 3 months they gave up and left. Seeing that this didn't work, my cousin family decided to desperately fuck with me. One night one of them walked into my apartment complex and started spraying pepper spray at my door to try and lure me out. Unfortunately for him, I was cleaning the house and doing some minor work after the goons they hired. All of my doors were pretty insulated with rags and towels to prevent concrete dust flying everywhere. I barely smelled the pepper spray. Court was due next day. I barely convinced my mother to ask for her sister to be eliminated from inhering anything. After I showed the court video, an audio of them threatening and assaulting me, it was done. The court ruled in our favor. Upon returning from court, I went to the police to tell them about the pepper spray incident. I was rushed into a room and questioned. Turned out my elderly neighbor died from lung complications caused by the PS. Here I am today, just returned from the notary, where my mother signed all the real estate to her name. I got a significant amount of money for assault, and threats, and my piece of shit aunt is left with her tiny apartment and a son in prison for assault, threats of violence and homicide. Her second son was fired from the rescue team and is no longer able to work for any government or social structures, and he doesn't know how to do anything else. They're bankrupt, and it serves them right. Story 2. So, I've got an acquaintance who has always been of the I know better than you school of thought. What makes it worse is that he literally received his PhD in physics from one of my country's top universities about 6 months ago, so he's not a dummy. The problem is that he thinks that because he's a physics genius, that means he knows better than everyone about everything. Just an example, my kids are in Montessori schools. This is a decision my wife and I reached together, and we're very happy with it. When he heard, he went on a 30-minute lecture about how we're throwing our money away and Montessori is nonsense. When I told him that I had read and even professionally translated studies proving the opposite, and gave him some real-world examples, he still would not admit he might not be 100% correct. Not the subject of this revenge, but so you understand the person we're dealing with. Another thing that's important to note is that Richard does not have Asperger's or anything similar. We joke about this all the time, and he's been tested from here until next week. He's just a really smart, socially oblivious, pain in the ass. Given all of the above, I try to limit my time with him, but unfortunately, that isn't always possible. And last week we were both at the same group braai for a friend who was visiting back home from overseas. I've known Jack since grade school, so we brought our families and made it more than just a long time, no see type of thing. At some point later on in the afternoon, my eldest came to me really sad and said she wanted to go home. When I asked her why, she said that Richard had just spent 15 minutes telling her that she shouldn't eat hot dogs because they're unhealthy, and he explained what went into hot dogs and what they're made out of. Awesome is not a vegetarian, knows that the beef and chicken she eats used to be live animals, and has never professed interest in vegetarianism. At the same time, when a kid is eating a hot dog, they don't care or want to know what's inside. We spoke a bit. I calmed her down and I told her to ignore Richard and go play with her siblings and her friends. Being a kid, she was thankfully easily distracted by something else and moved on. I didn't want to make a fuss with Jack or with Richard, so I just let it be. This turned out to be a mistake. About 30 minutes later I heard Awesome scream and begin crying. I ran over to her. Richard had come up to her and knocked her hot dog out of her hand, saying she shouldn't eat that garbage. I handed Awesome over to my wife for damage control, and I took Richard aside and told him that you don't ever talk to a man's kids without permission. B, you don't ever teach a man's kids without permission. And C, you sure as shit don't ever touch a man's kids without permission. He doesn't have kids, so I still wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. This turned out to be a mistake. Instead of doing the mature thing and moving on, he decided to double down on the hot dog issue. This was the hill he was going to die on. My kids shouldn't be eating hot dogs. Keeping Jack in mind, I disengaged and told him to stay the fuck away from my family. For the rest of the RV I kept my eye on him, and he didn't come near them. Jack enjoyed. We all ate some good meat. End of the story as far as I'm concerned. This turned out to be a mistake. A few days later we received a visit from a child protection officer who claimed that we were neglecting our kids. Specifically Awesome. She came in and saw that while the house could have been cleaner, everything was fine. She sat with Awesome for a few minutes and asked her some questions, said everything was fine, and left. First thing I did was call a friend of mine who is a lawyer, just to be on the safe side. He said it looked to him like we were in the clear, but we should keep in touch with him just in case. Next, I began working the grapevine. It turned out that Richard had been offended by how I treated him after the hot dog incident, so he filed a false anonymous report. Being Richard, and never thinking he could ever be wrong, he was even talking about it as if people should be proud of him for what he did. I had to make sure, though, so the last thing I did before dropping the hammer on him was confronting him personally. I set my phone to record and went to his house. He doubled down yet again, saying we were torturing Awesome. He's the one who called protective services on us, and he'd do it again in a heartbeat. This turned out to be a mistake. I'm not the violent type, but I swear I wanted to break the son of a bitch in half. I told him that if he came near myself or anyone in my family again, I'd have a restraining order put out on him, and I'd make sure every single one of our shared acquaintances knew why. I listened to the recording in my car, and his admission that he filed a false report came out clear as day. I immediately forwarded it to my lawyer, who said he'll get the ball rolling with some friends of his with the public prosecutor to see if we could get Richard in trouble, using his admission. Still waiting on that. The wheels of justice turn slowly sometimes. Then, I enacted my actual revenge. See, after he got his PhD, Richard bragged about the new flat he'd be moving into as soon as he sold his current flat. To that end, he renovated most of his current flat, including putting in lots of new features that required lots of electrical work. He did the same on his new flat. He did most of the electrical work himself, which is a big no-no unless you're licensed. I called in an inspector on both of his flats, who asked to see certification on who did the electrical work. Obviously, there was no certification. It wouldn't surprise me if, Richard being Richard, he began arguing with the inspector that his work was good enough and he didn't need to pay someone else to do it for him. I haven't seen or spoken to Richard since, but I've heard that he had to bring in a certified electrician to examine every single change he made in both flats. This meant dismantling everything and having it inspected. Turns out the buyers of his old flat weren't happy with the delay in receiving the keys, and were even unhappier when they learned why there was a delay. They walked away from the deal and are taking him to court, because his sale fell through. He's now in the hole paying mortgages on 2 flats. I don't know if there was a fine levied against him, but I sure as hell hope so.